The air in Veritas was the kind you paid a fortune to breathe. It wasn't just cool and scented with bergamot, an expensive perfume. It felt clean, as if all the noise and grime of the city had been filtered out at the door. The lighting was a masterclass in shadows, leaving faces half in mystery, while making the crystal glasses on every table sparkle like captured stars. This was a fortress of quiet money and softer power, and everyone inside knew their place. At a small, discreet table near the back wall, a young woman moved with a silent efficiency. She wore the staff uniform, a simple black dress that fell to her knees, neat and unremarkable. In her hands, she carried a heavy tray of empty glasses, her movements smooth so the ice cubes in them wouldn't clink. Her name was Elena, and she was very good at being invisible. To the patrons, she was just part of the room's machinery. They saw the dress, the tray, maybe a fleeting smile, but never the person. Elena preferred it that way. It gave her space to think. Tonight, as her polished black shoes whispered across the dark wood floor, her mind was 1,000 miles away from cocktails and table numbers. Behind her eyes, a sheet of music was unfolding. It was Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, a piece so fiendishly difficult it was called a pianist's Mount Everest. She was learning it, not at a piano, but in the quiet landscape of her thoughts, memorizing the wild, cascading runs of Ondine and the haunting, dissonant bells of Le Gibbet. She was a student, a graduate student in classical composition, and the only way she could afford to live in this city, let alone pay her tuition, was by working nights here. The grand piano on the low stage, a sleek, black beast of an instrument, was a constant, aching temptation. She had never touched it. Staff DIDN single quotes T. Her shift was a dance of observation and anticipation. She refilled a water glass before the man in the tailored suit could glance at it. She cleared a dessert plate with a tiny, almost imperceptible nod from the woman in silk. She was a ghost in the machine, and she was exhausted. The featured performer for the evening, a jazz pianist with a famous name, was taking his final bow. The room offered a warm, appreciative ripple of applause. He had been brilliant, technically perfect, and as emotionally familiar as the expensive wallpaper. He stepped off the stage, and a low, comfortable hum of conversation settled back over the room. High above the main floor, on a mezzanine level accessible only by a private staircase, sat the owner of all of this. He was a man in his early 50s, with silver-gray hair cut sharp and close. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's yearly rent, and he sat perfectly still, watching the room below, not as a host enjoying his party, but as a scientist observing an experiment. His name was Julian Thorne, and he was bored. Boredom, for a man like him, was a dangerous thing. He had built an empire from nothing, solved impossible problems, acquired companies and art and islands. Now, surrounded by perfection, he found everything predictable. The music, the people, the conversations, it all felt like a script he had already read. His eyes, a pale, chilly blue, scanned the room and landed on the staff. They moved like clockwork figures, efficient, soulless. An idea, cold and sudden, formed in his mind. It wasn't a kind idea. It was an experiment, a way to puncture the sterile bubble of the evening. He lifted a finger, the barest twitch of motion. From the shadows near the staircase, his club manager, a nervous man named Robert, who lived in constant fear of Thorne's disapproval, appeared as if summoned by magic. He leaned down. "The piano," Thorne said, his voice quiet, but so clear it cut through the soft jazz still playing in the speakers. "It sits there like a museum piece after the talent leaves. Let's see if it has any purpose for the rest of the evening." Robert blinked. "Sir, should I call for the standby pianist?" "No," Thorne said, his gaze drifting back to the floor. "The piano is now an instrument of the staff. Let's see if any of them have more substance than the people we pay to perform. Robert's face went pale. The staff, sir? Waiters and bartenders? You have ears, Robert. Yes. Thorne's lips thinned into something that wasn't a smile. A little democratic entertainment. Let's see what hidden talents my money is paying for. Start with someone. Anyone. Down below, Elena had just delivered a final round of after-dinner drinks to a table of laughing financiers. She was turning to head back to the service station, her mind drifting again to a particularly tricky fingering in the ravel. When she felt a light, urgent tap on her shoulder, it was Robert. He looked stricken. Elena, come with me, please. A bolt of cold fear shot through her. Had she messed up an order? Spilled something? Her tips for the night, carefully tucked away, felt suddenly at risk. Is something wrong, Mr. Robert? Just come, quickly. He led her, not toward the kitchen, but toward the edge of the low stage where the grand piano sat. The soft lights had been turned up slightly on it, making it look like an exhibit. A few nearby patrons noticed, and their conversations dipped, curious eyes following the waitress being led to the stage. Robert's voice was a low, embarrassed mutter. Mr. Thorne's request. A staff performance. You play, don't you? I think I heard you mention it once. Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. She did play. She lived to play. But not here. Not like this. For fun, yes, but I'm not. This isn't? Please, Robert whispered, desperation in his eyes. Just play something. Anything. Chopsticks, I don't care. Or he'll pick someone else, and it'll be a whole awful thing. He was pleading with her. She looked from his panicked face to the sea of expectant, well-dressed strangers, then up to the mezzanine. There, in the shadows, she saw him. Julian Thorne. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the railing, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. He wasn't smiling. He was observing. Waiting. It was a trap. She knew it in her bones. A cruel game for a bored rich man. Refusing would mean her job. Agreeing meant humiliation. The room had grown quieter. All the eyes felt like pins on her skin. Her waitress dress, which had been her cloak of invisibility, now felt like a glaring costume. She was on display, with legs that felt like wood. She walked the 3 steps up onto the stage. The polished surface of the piano stretched before her, vast and intimidating. She set her tray down on a nearby stool, the glasses giving a faint, betraying rattle. She wiped her suddenly damp palms on her dress and slowly, carefully, lowered herself onto the plush piano bench. The silence was absolute now. Every conversation had died. She could feel hundreds of breaths being held. She looked at the keys, a prison of black and white. Her mind, usually so full of music, was a roaring blank. The complex Ravel piece had vanished. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her ears. She had to play something, anything. She placed her trembling fingers on the cool ivory and began the only thing her panicked brain could grasp, the simple 4-chord progression of a pop ballad that was currently all over the radio. It was basic. It was safe. It was the musical equivalent of a shrug. The notes echoed in the quiet room, thin and unimpressive. She played it through once, mechanically. A smattering of polite, almost pitying applause came from a few tables. Someone gave a soft, amused chuckle. The tension in the room broke, but into something worse, mild entertainment at her expense. She was a curiosity, a waitress trying to be fancy. She kept her eyes glued to her hands, her cheeks burning. Then a voice cut through the room. It came from above, cold, clear, and without a shred of mercy. It was a voice used to being obeyed, and it didn't need to shout to be heard by everyone. Again? The single word hung in the air. Elena froze, her hands still on the keys. The voice continued, dripping with a disdain that made her stomach clench. Play something with feeling. Or do you only know how to carry drinks? The cruelty of it was so precise, so public, it stole the air from her lungs. The few claps died instantly. A new, deeper silence fell, this one thick with awkward horror and a voyeuristic thrill. This was the real show. Elena sat there, humiliated, exposed under the bright lights. The pop chords felt like ash in her mouth. But then, deep beneath the shame, something else stirred. A spark, a hard, stubborn little coal of anger. He wasn't just mocking her. He was hunting. He was bored, and he was poking at something, waiting for a reaction, for a crack of real emotion. Fine, she thought, a strange calm settling over her panic. You want feeling? She closed her eyes, blocking out the glittering room, the pitiless man above, the sea of faces. She thought of her grandmother's small, warm apartment, the smell of paprika and old books. She thought of the battered, out-of-tune upright piano against the wall, its yellowed keys. And she heard, clear as a bell in her memory, a melody, a sad, beautiful, ancient Hungarian folk song her grandmother would hum while she cooked. A song of leaving, of loss, of a love that crossed mountains and never died. Elena took a slow, deep breath, settling into the bench. Her posture changed, the nervous hunch melting away into a poised readiness. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer scared. They were focused, distant. She wasn't in Veritas anymore. Her hands lifted, hovered for a moment, and then descended. The first note she played was not a chord. It was a single, deep, resonant tone from the bass clef, like a distant bell tolling. Then another, a half-step higher, aching with dissonance. Then her right hand came in, not with a tune, but with a flutter of high, clear notes like falling tears. This was no pop song. It was a story. And from the very first measure, everyone in the room knew it. The single deep note from the piano didn't just sound. It seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. It was a sound that didn't belong in Veritas. It wasn't background music. It wasn't entertainment. It was a feeling given sound. Elena's face had lost all its fearful tension. Her eyes were open, but they were looking at something far beyond the polished wood of the piano's lid. They were seeing her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and strong, kneading dough on a flour-dusted table. She was hearing the old woman's voice, not singing, but humming a tune that was all curves and sorrow. A tune that had crossed an ocean in memory alone. Her left hand laid down a foundation, not a simple chord progression, but a slow, walking pattern in a minor key. It was the rhythm of a tired heart, of footsteps on a long road. It was steady, inevitable, and deeply sad. Then her right hand began to speak. The melody that emerged was simple at first, just a few notes curling upwards like a question, like a hand reaching for something just out of grasp. At the polite, amused atmosphere in the club evaporated in seconds. The man who had been about to take a sip of his 30-year-old scotch held his glass halfway to his lips, forgotten. The woman who had been whispering a piece of gossip to her friend simply stopped, her mouth slightly open. There was no more shifting in seats, no more clinking of ice. The waitstaff at the edges of the room stood frozen, trays in hand. She wasn't just playing notes. She was building a world. The simple folk melody returned, but this time it was dressed in richer harmonies. Her left hand grew more active, creating a rippling, wave-like effect underneath the tune. It was the memory of the Danube. Her grandmother had once said, "A river you carry inside you." The music swelled, not in volume, but in complexity and emotion. It spoke of green hills and dark forests, of a home left behind not by choice, but by the cruel turns of history not high up on the mezzanine. Julian Thorne was no longer leaning on the railing in casual judgment. He was standing straight up, his knuckles white where they gripped the dark wood. The cold, bored expression was gone, shattered. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the woman at the piano. It was as if he'd been struck by a silent bolt of lightning down on the stage. Elena was somewhere else. The room, the people, the humiliation, it had all melted away. The music was using her now. She leaned into the keys, her body moving with the phrases. A particularly sorrowful passage made her shoulders slump. A moment of defiant, soaring beauty in the melody saw her back straighten, her chin lift. Sweat beaded at her temple, but she didn't notice. This was no performance. This was an exorcism, a confession, a gift laid bare. She began to improvise, weaving new threads into the old tapestry. She introduced a series of sharp, glittering arpeggios high on the keyboard, the sound of broken glass, or perhaps stars seen through tears. Then she brought the original melody back, and now it was slower, heavier, weighed down by all that had come before. The walking bass in her left hand became a funeral march. This was the deepest point of the sorrow. The music was almost too painful to hear, a raw nerve of loss. A few people in the audience looked down at their hands, emotionally overwhelmed. The air felt thick dot, and then something changed. Elena's fingers slowed. The funeral march softened, faded. There was a pause, a silence that hung for just a beat, full of the echo of what had been. Then, with a tenderness that made several people in the room catch their breath, she began a new variation. The same Hungarian folk tune emerged again, but now it was transformed. The harmonies were warmer, major chords bleeding into the minor ones, like sunlight through storm clouds. The rhythm eased, lost its heaviness, and became a gentle, rocking lullaby that it was no longer a song about what was lost. It was a song about what was carried. The love, the memory, the spirit these had survived. The melody rose, clear and bright, and full of a quiet, unbreakable hope. It was breathtaking. It was the sound of resilience. She took the melody up one last time, her right hand singing it out with a pure, bell-like tone over a bed of rich, resonant chords from her left. It was a statement, a victory. Then she began to let it go. The notes became fewer, the spaces between them longer. The lullaby rocked itself to sleep. A final, simple chord, sweet and resolved, hung in the air and then silence. A perfect, absolute, and profound silence. Elena's hands came to rest gently in her lap. She was breathing heavily, spent, as if she had just run a long way. She slowly blinked, coming back to herself, to the room, to the lights. The first thing she felt was not pride, but a deep vulnerability. She had just shown her soul to a room full of strangers. And the silence felt like a void waiting to swallow her. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. 4, 5. It was broken not by applause, but by a sound. A harsh, choked gasp. It came from the mezzanine. Every head in the room, including Elena's, snapped upward. Julian Thorne was still standing, but the powerful, controlled billionaire was gone. In his place was a man who looked ravaged. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. One hand was pressed flat against his chest, as if to steady a heart beating too fast. He stared at Elena, not with ownership or cold curiosity, but with a kind of shocked, desperate recognition. The look in his eyes was one of pure, undiluted agony. He moved suddenly, turning from the railing. The spell of stillness broke for everyone else. A tsunami of sound erupted in the club. Thunderous, roaring applause exploded from every table. People rose to their feet, their faces alight with awe, shouting, "Bravo!" The sound was physical, A wave of admiration had hit the stage. The waitstaff was clapping hardest of all, their faces filled with stunned pride, but Elena hardly heard it. Her eyes were locked on the empty space on the mezzanine where Thorne had been. He was gone. Then she saw him. He was coming down the private staircase, his movements stiff and hurried. He ignored the manager, Robert, who rushed toward him. He brushed past a waiter without seeing him. His gaze was a laser, fixed on her. The crowd between the staircase and the stage instinctively parted for him, the applause faltering into a confused, buzzing murmur as people saw his expression. He walked right up to the edge of the stage, which put him just below her where she sat at the piano. He stopped. The noise of the room seemed to fade into a distant buzz again for the two of them. He looked up at her, and his voice, when it came, was nothing like the cold, commanding instrument from before. It was ragged. It was broken. It was the voice of a man who had just seen a ghost. "Where?" he whispered, the words scraping out of him. "Where did you learn that?" Elena could only stare, confused, her mind still half in the world of the music. "Learn? What? The folk song?" "It was from my grandmother. She was Hungarian." Thorne took a sharp step back, as if the words were physical blows. "The second theme," he insisted, his voice trembling with an urgency that was almost frightening. "When the left hand rises here." He hummed a specific twisting series of notes, his pitch imperfect, but the contour unmistakable. It was the exact fragment from her improvisation. "That modulation. That is not just a folk song. Who taught you that?" The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. This wasn't about power or humiliation anymore. This was about something vital, something personal, to the point of pain. "No one taught me," Elena said, her own voice soft with bewilderment. "I mean, the melody is from her. But what I played, I was just playing what I felt. I improvised it." "Impossible," he breathed, but he said it to himself, not to her. He looked lost, ancient. He ran a hand over his face. When he looked back at her, his eyes were shining with a moisture he didn't bother to hide. "Your grandmother? What was her name?" "Catalin," Elena said. The name landed in the space between them with the weight of a lifetime. Julian Thorne closed his eyes. A single clear tear escaped, tracing a line down his cheek. He swayed on his feet. For a terrifying second, Elena thought the most powerful man in the room was going to collapse. When he opened his eyes again, he looked only at her. All the walls were down. All the coldness was gone. "Catalin," he repeated, the name a prayer on his lips. She was the love of my life. And that, what you just played, that was her music. The word hung in the air between them, a single fragile bridge thrown across a chasm of years and pain. Catalin. The roaring applause from the room seemed to push in on them, a wave of noise that made the quiet space around the piano feel even more isolated. Elena could only stare at Julian Thorne. The man who had been a terrifying, distant figure of power moments ago now stood before her, pale and shaken, looking at her as if she held the answer to a question that had tortured him for decades. "Come," he said, his voice still unsteady, but edged with a new command, not of cruelty, but of desperate need. He gestured not toward the grand, open spaces of the club, but toward the private staircase. "Please." Robert, the manager, materialized at Thorne's elbow, his face a mask of frantic concern. "Sir, the guests." "Your table." "See to them," Thorne said, not even looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Elena. "Cancel the rest of the evening. Comp everyone. I don't care. Just do it." He began to walk toward the stairs, and after a moment of stunned hesitation, Elena stood. Her legs felt weak, like they were made of cloth. The crowd was still clapping, staring at her with a mix of awe and confusion. She felt exposed, the emotional nakedness of her performance now compounded by this bizarre, private drama. She grabbed her empty service tray, a silly, instinctual move to hold on to something familiar, and followed him. The climb up the staircase felt endless. The noise of the club fell away, replaced by a thick, tense silence. The mezzanine was a small, sleek space, a single table, a plush couch, a wall of dark glass looking out over the city lights. It was a perch, a place to observe without being seen. Thorne didn't sit. He went to a simple, modern cabinet and poured 2 glasses of water with shaking hands. He gave one to Elena. She took it, her fingers cold against the cool crystal. "Sit," he said, and it sounded more like a plea than an order. She sank onto the edge of the couch. He remained standing, pacing a short, tight path in front of the window. "Tell me," he said, stopping to look at her. "Tell me everything about her. Your grandmother, Catalin." Elena took a sip of water, trying to order her thoughts. There's not much to tell that seems important. She was just my grandmother. She lived in a small apartment across the river. She cooked a lot. She was quiet, but she had this strength. She hummed all the time. What did she hum? He asked, his voice intense. That song, the one I played. She said it was a song from her village. She said her mother sang it when they left, when they became refugees. Elena paused, searching his face. She never talked about her life before America. Not really. It was a closed door. Thorne nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something terrible. She was a pianist, a brilliant one, a true artist. He said it with a reverence that was painful to hear. We met in Budapest. It was a different world. She was playing in a cafe that was too small for her talent. I was just a student, an arrogant American with more ideas than money. A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips and vanished. I heard her play, and it rearranged me. It was like hearing color for the first time. He turned back to the window, his back to her. We had a year. One perfect, impossible year. She was going to come to the States. We had plans. Then the political situation. It became dangerous. Communications were cut. Families were watched. I was forced to leave. I promised I would get her out. I swore it. His shoulders tightened. By the time I had the resources, the connections, she was gone, vanished, no trace. I hired investigators. I searched for years. It was like she had been erased. Elena listened, her own heart aching for this young man he described, for her grandmother's silence. She never spoke of anyone. She married my grandfather here. He was a kind man, a carpenter. He died before I was born. Thorne turned around. His eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. The music you played, the second movement you created, the rising part with the dissonant harmony before it resolves. That was hers. It was a fragment of a piece she was writing. A sonata. She only ever played pieces of it for me. She said it was about memory, about a love that survives separation. That specific turn of phrase, that musical idea, it was her fingerprint. No one else could have known it unless she taught them. A cold understanding began to dawn on Elena. You made me play. You made all the staff play. You were listening for it. He didn't flinch from the accusation in her tone. He met it head on. Yes, for 30 years I have been listening. In concert halls, in music schools, in bars. I built this place, he gestured vaguely at the club below, not just as a business, but as a net. I thought, if I created a place for the best music, perhaps one day, someone who knew her, who learned from her, might pass through. It was a stupid, hopeless dream. And tonight, I was just bored and bitter. I wanted to prove that no one had that spark anymore. I wanted to write in my cynicism. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing her for the first time. And then you sat down, and you played from a place she taught me existed. You played her heart, and you played your own. The anger Elena felt melted away, replaced by a dizzying sense of connection. Her grandmother, the quiet woman with flour on her hands, had been this man's great love. The melody she hummed while chopping onions was a piece of a lost sonata, a message in a bottle that had finally reached shore. Did she have any papers? Diaries? Music? Thorne asked, the businessman in him surfacing through the emotion. Just a small box, Elena said. She left it to my mother, who never really looked through it. It's in our storage unit. Some photos, old letters in Hungarian, a few sheets of handwritten music that I thought were just scribbles. Thorne's breath caught. The manuscript. May I? Would you allow me to see it? Elena nodded slowly. Yes, I think. I think she would have wanted you to. The word wanted seemed to undo him again. He sat down heavily in a chair opposite her, the fight gone out of him. All this time, he whispered, more to himself than to her. All this time she was here. She had a family, a life. He looked at Elena, a new, profound sadness in his eyes. And I missed all of it. I was searching for a ghost, and the woman was living a world away. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past filling the sleek, modern room. What happens now? Elena finally asked. The question was small in the face of everything. Thorne took a deep, steadying breath. He sat up straighter, the composed man returning, but softer now, the edges worn smooth by grief. Now, he said, if you are willing, I would like to see that box. I would like to know her life, the one she built without me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And I would like, if you would allow it, to help you with yours. Elena shook her head quickly. I don't want your money. I'm not offering money, he said, and for the first time, she heard a note of the old sharpness, but it was directed at a problem to be solved. I heard what you can do. That wasn't just memory. That was genius. You are a composer, a real one. I am offering you what I should have offered her, a chance to be heard, access, a studio, an introduction to people who matter, not as a charity case, as an artist who just silenced my entire club with one song. The offer hung in the air, immense and terrifying. Elena thought of her tiny, noisy apartment, her mountain of student debt, the countless hours of practice squeezed between shifts. She thought of the Ravel piece in her head and the other pieces waiting to be born. She looked at Julian Thorne, not a billionaire, not a tyrant, but a man holding a piece of her grandmother's soul. She thought of Catalin, humming in her kitchen, keeping her music and her pain locked inside a quiet heart. Okay, Elena said, her voice firm, but on one condition. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of the old authority there. We work on her sonata together, Elena said. You help me piece it together from what you remember and what's in the box. I'll finish it. For her. Julian Thorne looked at the young woman on the couch, the waitress, the pianist, his lost love's granddaughter. He saw the same stubborn light in her eyes that he had fallen in love with a lifetime ago. He nodded, a single slow dip of his head. It's a deal. The storage unit was on the outskirts of the city, in a sprawling complex that smelled of concrete dust and distant rain. It was a world away from the scented air and soft lighting of Veritas. Elena led Julian Thorne down a long fluorescent-lit corridor, the wheels of her old suitcase rattling on the concrete floor. He walked beside her in silence, dressed in simple, dark clothes that still looked impossibly expensive. He seemed smaller here, out of his kingdom, just a man waiting for a door to open. Elena stopped at Unit 317. She fitted the key into the padlock, her hands cold. This felt more intimate, more vulnerable than playing the piano in front of a crowd. This was opening a tomb of quiet family history for a stranger to see. The metal door rolled up with a loud, groaning shriek. A wave of stale, cardboard-scented air wafted out. The unit was packed old furniture draped in sheets, stacks of books, her childhood bike leaning against a wall. At the front, labeled in her mother's neat handwriting, were 3 cardboard boxes marked Grandma Catalin. Elena dragged one out into the aisle. Thorne knelt on the concrete floor without hesitation, ignoring the dust. There was a reverence in his movement, a carefulness that made Elena's throat tighten. The first box held mostly photographs. Elena handed him a small, sepia-toned picture. It showed a young woman with serious eyes and dark hair swept up, seated at an upright piano in a playing room. Her hands were poised on the keys, and she was looking not at the camera, but at something just beyond it, a faint, private smile on her lips. Thorne took the photo. His breath left him in a soft rush. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the image. She was 20 here, he whispered. This was the cafe. The piano was horribly out of tune. She complained about it every day. A real smile, fragile and full of sorrow, touched his face. She said it fought her. He looked through more photos. Catalin in a winter coat on a bridge. Catalin laughing with a group of friends, the faces blurry with time. Each one was a piece of a life he never knew. Elena watched him, seeing the young man from his story emerge in the softness of his eyes. The second box held everyday things. A worn recipe book filled with spidery Hungarian script, a set of hand-embroidered napkins, a few pieces of delicate costume jewelry. Thorne held a deep blue glass bead on a silver chain. "I gave this to her," he said, his voice thick, "for her birthday. It cost me a month's stipend. She said it was the color of the Danube at midnight." He closed his fingers around it, his head bowed. It was the third box that held the treasure. Beneath a folded, lace-trimmed tablecloth, there was a faded leather portfolio. Elena's heart beat faster as she lifted it out. She untied the brittle string. Inside were sheets of handwritten music. The notes were penned in a hurried, passionate hand, with corrections and markings scribbled in the margins. At the bottom of the stack were letters. Tied with a faded ribbon. Thorne took the top sheet of music. His eyes scanned the lines, and he began to hum, low and off-key, the same fragment he had recognized the night before. "This is it," he breathed. The opening motif of the second movement. She was stuck here. See? He pointed to a scribbled-out section. She couldn't find the transition. She said it was like a word on the tip of her tongue. Elena took another sheet. It was a variation on the folk melody, more complex than anything she had improvised. Seeing it on paper, in her grandmother's hand, was like receiving a message directly from the past. She was brilliant, Elena murmured, the musician in her understanding the sophistication on the page. She was, Thorne agreed quietly. She could have been one of the greats. He reached for the packet of letters. He untied the ribbon with infinite care. The paper was thin and crackly. They were in Hungarian. He scanned the first one, his brow furrowed. "My Hungarian is rusty. It's to a friend, I think. She's talking about the difficulty of getting practice time." He flipped to the next, and then the next. His face, which had been soft with remembrance, slowly tightened. He stopped on one page, his eyes flying over the words. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" Elena asked, alarmed. He didn't answer for a moment. He just stared at the page, his jaw clenched. When he spoke, his voice was flat, hollow. "It's to her sister. She writes. She writes that she is with child." The air in the cramped aisle turned to ice. She says she cannot tell the father. He is an American student, and it would ruin his life, complicate everything. The situation is too dangerous. She has decided to go to a home for unwed mothers. She will give the child up. She says it is the only way to keep the baby safe and to set him free. Thorne looked up, his eyes shattered. The date. It's 2 months after I was forced to leave. The truth landed between them, heavy and absolute. Elena's mind raced, pieces of her own family history clicking into a new, heartbreaking shape. Her grandfather, the kind carpenter, had married Catalin when she was already pregnant. He had adopted the baby as his own. It was a quiet, loving secret they had taken to their graves. "My mother," Elena whispered. "Your daughter." Thorne made a small, choked sound. He leaned back against the cold metal wall of the unit, the letter fluttering in his hand. He looked utterly broken. The search, the decades of longing, the cruelty born of his loss, it had all been for a woman who had sacrificed everything, including telling him the truth, to protect what they had made. "All this time," he said, the words raw, "I had a daughter. She had my child. And I never knew. I was searching for a ghost, and my own blood was living and breathing in the same city." He looked at Elena, a new, staggering realization dawning in his eyes. "And you are my granddaughter." The word hung in the dusty air. Grandfather. It didn't fit the sleek billionaire, but it fit the broken man on the floor, holding the proof of a lifetime's love and loss. Elena didn't know what to feel. It was too big, too sudden. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was her bloodline. The man who had forced her to play, who had hurt her grandmother's soul in her fingers, was family. She saw not the powerful Julian Thorne, but a man who had missed first steps, school plays, weddings. A man who had never held his own child. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his regret filled the space. He didn't move toward her. He didn't try to hug her or claim her. He just sat there, lost in a grief that was 30 years deeper than he'd ever imagined. "What was her name?" he finally asked, his voice a rough whisper. "My daughter. Anna," Elena said softly. "She was a teacher. She loved gardening. She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer." He closed his eyes, absorbing this new loss. A pain for a person he had never met, but now belonged to him. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on his cheek. "I am so sorry," he said, the words directed at the ghost of his daughter, at Catalin, at Elena, for everything. For my behavior that night, for not being there, for all of it. The apology was simple, and it was everything. Elena, her own eyes stinging, reached into the box. She pulled out a small, flat object wrapped in tissue paper. She unwrapped it. It was a polished river stone, smooth and gray. A note in her. Grandmother's hand was tucked around it, in English this time. It read, "From the Danube, to remember the water that connects all things." She handed it to Thorne. She kept this. All these years. He took the stone, holding it in his palm, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. It was a piece of the river he remembered, a touchstone she had carried across an ocean and a lifetime. For a long time, they just sat there on the cold floor, surrounded by the silent history in the boxes. The anger, the shame, the distance, it had all crumbled away, leaving only a vast, shared sadness and the faint, fragile beginnings of something new. Finally, Thorne took a deep, shuddering breath and carefully placed the letters and the music back into the portfolio. He handled them as if they were holy relics. "You said we would finish her sonata," he said, looking at Elena. His voice was stronger now, grounded in a new purpose. "I would like that more than anything in the world. Not in my club, in a proper hall, where it belongs." He paused. "And I would like, if you are willing, to hear about Anna. Everything. Every single thing you remember." Elena looked at this man, her grandfather. She saw the ghost of her grandmother's love in his eyes, and the echo of her own mother's features in his face. It was a mystery, a tragedy, and a family, all at once. She nodded, giving him the only thing she truly could. "Okay," she said. "Let's go home." A year later, the stage of the city's oldest concert hall was nothing like the sleek, dark stage at Veritas. This wood was honey-colored and worn by generations of feet. The air smelled of resin and dust, not perfume. The only light came from a single elegant spotlight, and under it sat, not a grand, modern piano, but a beautiful old-fashioned instrument made of rich, reddish wood. Elena waited in the wings. She wore a simple dark green dress. Her hands were calm at her sides. There was no tray to hold on to, no uniform to hide in. She was just herself. In the front row, sitting not in a private mezzanine, but right there among the audience, was Julian Thorne. He sat straight in his seat, his hands clasped in his lap. He looked like any other proud, nervous family member. The journey to this night had not been simple. It wasn't a fairy tale where a billionaire grandfather fixed everything. It was slow, quiet, and real. After the storage unit, they had fallen into a routine. 2 or 3 afternoons a week, Elena would go to Thorne's apartment. It wasn't the cold, modern penthouse she expected, but a spacious, book-filled place with a beautiful, well-used Bissendorfer piano in the living room. The first few times were awkward, filled with a heavy silence. They would make tea. He would ask a hesitant question. What was Anna's favorite color? Yellow. Like sunflowers. He would nod, filing the information away like a precious fact. He hung a painting of sunflowers in his hallway. He told her stories of Budapest, not just about Catalan, but about the smoky cafe, his terrible Hungarian, the way the light fell on the river in winter. She told him stories of her mother, how she could make anything grow, her terrible singing in the car, the way she'd held Elena's hand too tight on the first day of school, and they worked on the music. They spread Catalan's handwritten pages across his large dining table. Thorne's memory was a fragile, surprising thing. He would hum a phrase Elena couldn't find on the paper. It went like this, after this part, he'd say, and she would sit at the piano and try to match his humming to the keys, scribbling down the notes. Sometimes he was wrong. Sometimes the melody he remembered was tangled with 30 years of missing her. Elena would gently suggest a different chord, a smoother transition. "Yes," he'd say, his eyes closed, listening. "That's closer." That's what she wanted to say. It became a collaboration. He was the archaeologist, carefully brushing the dust off the past. She was the architect, helping to rebuild the sonata with her own understanding, making sure it stood strong. The piece they assembled was not a perfect reconstruction. It was something new. It held Catalan's aching, beautiful themes, but it also had Elena's musical voice, the hints of Ravel's complexity, the raw emotion she'd poured out that first night at Veritas. It was a conversation across time. Thorne had offered her everything a manager, a recording contract, a debut at an even bigger hall. She had refused almost all of it. She accepted only 2 things. First, his quiet pull to get her this audition with the city's respected chamber music society. She won the spot on her own merit. Second, she let him pay off her student loans. She fought him on it, but he was firm. "It is not a gift," he said, his businessman's voice returning. "It is an investment in an artist I believe in, and it is one less thing for my granddaughter to worry about." She couldn't argue with the way he said, "granddaughter." It still sounded strange, but it was real. Now, the house lights dimmed. A quiet fell over the hall. Elena walked onto the stage. The applause was warm, polite. This audience was here for the music, not for drama. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands in her lap for a moment. She didn't look at Thorn. She looked at the piano, her partner in all of this. She began not with Catalin's sonata, but with a short piece by Chopin. It was flawless, technically perfect, and beautifully felt. It earned sincere applause. It was her way of saying to the serious music critics in the crowd, "I belong here." After a slight pause, she let her hands find a different place on the keyboard. The air in the hall seemed to shift. She began the first movement of Catalin's sonata. The opening was Thorn's memory, a series of questioning, lonely notes, like someone walking an empty street at night. Then came the folk melody, simple and clear, the way Catalin must have first played it. Elena's body moved with the music, not with dramatic flair, but with a deep connection. She was the vessel for two stories now. She moved into the second movement. This was the heart of it, the music of longing. The left hand built that same walking, heart-like rhythm from the night at Veritas, but now it was richer, more developed. The right hand sang the melody Thorn had recognized, the one that had shattered him. She played it not with the stormy passion of that first night, but with a profound, gentle sorrow. It was no longer just her grief or Catalin's. It was their shared understanding of loss. In the front row, Thorn did not cry. He simply listened, his face still, absorbing the sound of a love he'd thought was lost forever, now returned to him in this form. Then came the third movement, the one they had built together. It began with the struggle Catalin's manuscript showed a frantic, searching passage. Then, Elena's own composition took over. It was the sound of acceptance. The folk melody returned, but it was transformed, woven into complex, hopeful harmonies. It was no longer a memory of a place left behind, but a celebration of a life that was built anyway. It was Anna's life. It was Elena's own voice, finding its power. The music built to a climax that was not loud, but bright, a brilliant, major-key sunrise of sound that felt earned, not cheap. The final notes were quiet. A series of gentle, resolved chords that settled like a sigh, like a final, peaceful breath. The silence that followed was different from the one at Veritas. That had been shock. This was respect. A deep, collective holding of breath. Then the applause erupted. It was a wave, strong and true. People rose to their feet. Elena stood, her legs a little weak, and took a bow. She looked at Thorn. He was standing too, clapping steadily, his face glowing with a pride that had nothing to do with business or power. Backstage later, there was a small crowd well-wishers, the director of the society. Thorn waited at the edge of it, allowing her the moment. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached. He didn't say, "Bravo," or "You were magnificent." He held out a small, flat box, wrapped in plain paper. For after the premiere, he said simply, inside was not jewelry or anything expensive. It was a framed photograph. On the left was the picture of young Catalin at the cafe piano. On the right was a photo Elena had never seen. A young Julian, smiling and tousle-haired, his arm around Catalin on the Budapest Bridge. In the middle was a photo of Elena's mother, Anna, laughing in a sunflower yellow dress. Across the bottom of the mat, in Thorn's precise handwriting, it read, "For the music that connects all things." Elena's eyes filled. She looked at him. "Thank you." "No," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you." He cleared his throat. "There's a piano back at the apartment. I was thinking, if you're not too tired, we could look at that Ravel piece you're studying. I'd like to hear it." It was an invitation not to the past, but to the present, to a shared, ordinary future. Elena smiled, wiping a thumb under her eye. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." They left the hall not through a grand entrance, but through a side door, stepping into the cool night air of the ordinary city. The glittering world of Veritas felt like a lifetime ago. He didn't call for a driver. They just started walking down the quiet street, a sound of their footsteps mingling. The sonata was finished. The mystery was solved. The lost were found. But the music, as they both now understood, was never really about an ending. It was about the quiet, persistent melody that keeps going, in a new key, on a new street, carried in the hands of the next generation, connecting one lonely heart to another.